I'm excited to introduce Nicole Page, who is a partner at Reavis Page Jump in New York City and leads the firm's entertainment and media practice. She specializes in legal matters for nonfiction and fiction productions across film, television, and digital platforms. Welcome to the show, Nicole.
Hi, Tammy. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you. Such an honor. And in saying that, I wanted to know what led you to becoming a lawyer and
Mm.
now working in an all-female firm.
Well, what led me to becoming a lawyer is my mother made me. Um, but one of the things that I discovered about being in the practice of law for many years is that there's really something for everyone. Whether it's entertainment law or employment law or medical malpractice, whatever is something that you're interested in, you can find something in the law that kind of aligns with your interests. And for me, because what I really wanted to do was be an actress, I was very much attracted to entertainment law. I didn't start off as an entertainment lawyer, but I was able to transition into the practice, and it was really gratifying to find that part of being an entertainment lawyer meant going to Sundance every year and going to other film festivals and being with people who are creative, and that is just a wonderful client base to have because I'm personally interested, very much interested in their projects and what they're doing, and um, I found my niche. So that was how I kind of ended up here. And our firm, Revis Page Jump, is based in Manhattan, and the three founding members, all of us are women, and we do have men and women at the firm, but the founders are all women. Part of what we deal with at the firm, in addition to entertainment laws, we do a lot of employment work, a lot of employment discrimination, sexual harassment work, and that is something that has enormous crossover into my entertainment practice. But it's also, I think, sets a real model for how to treat people in the workplace, and it's just been a great environment, I think, for not just for the partners, but for the people who are there as well.
Oh my God. The most daunting thing I think is contracts and
Yes.
understanding them, right? So, could you describe what the fundamental components of a film contract for cast and crew is?
Yeah, and what I always tell everyone at the outset is a contract is a good thing. I think a lot of people are afraid of contracts, but it does a few different things. It sets out everybody's expectations right at the beginning. And one thing that we've seen over and over again is that when there are not clear expectations communicated at the very beginning of a project, it's a recipe for disaster. Because, what we've seen a lot is people get together, they collaborate, and then they just go and they start shooting and then they ask this friend to, can you do some pickup shoots and could you do some editing? And nobody's talking about what this means in terms of compensation or credit or ownership of the film, and there's no documentation. And then first it's just a fun project, and now all of a sudden, well, there's money. There's like this is actually going to be something, and nobody knows what it means for them personally, and that's when a lot of disputes arise. So frankly, the cheapest and smartest thing you can do when you're starting any kind of film production is get your contracts in place. And even if all you can do, because you have no money for an attorney, is put out an email of deal points and have the other person agree, then at least you have some concept of what everyone's agreeing to. But that's the thing. So and a lot of times also what's interesting is in the course of a contract negotiation, you find that the person you're negotiating with is really has a totally different concept of what this arrangement is supposed to be than you do. And it's an opportunity to kind of get out before you get in too deep if the person is really not aligned with your take on what's supposed to happen here. I think of contracts as a blueprint for a relationship. And it's like you wouldn't build a building if you didn't have a blueprint, because then your building will fall down. And it's the same way to look at a contract and a relationship. I also find that people view speaking about contracts or compensation or credit as somehow it's confrontational and they want to avoid confrontation, but it's really just the opposite. And I think it's really important for filmmakers, producers to be very clear about what they want and what they expect and not look at it, well, if I ask for this, I'm going to offend my friend. It's a business. You have to look at it like a business. And, I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone say, "Well, no, but they're, the co-writer is my best friend. Why do we need any?" And it's like that's when it's always going to get messed up when it's your best friend because then everyone's afraid to talk about things and it's just assumed somehow that because of your friendship is going to translate into a business relationship, and that is like a mythology. That is not how it works. And a lot of friendships get ruined because there is no contract and there is no understanding about what the expectations are.
I totally agree to that, and it's just so sad that it's so scary for us sometimes to ask for contracts or we wait too long. We're already in the project and we still haven't received the contract yet, and we're timid to ask, "Hey, where's the contract? Can I sign that?" And I'm already starting the role and I'm not really clear. I don't know why we feel that way. I you know
I don't know either. I mean, if you were at any other job and, you hadn't gotten your compensation yet or you hadn't got the terms of your employment, you would ask for it. You're really an employee of this production, essentially. So, of course, you should know the terms of your employment. So, no, I really encourage everybody to put aside that fear. I mean, if you're a professional in this business, it is absolutely expected that you're going to ask for a contract. You're going to want to understand what you're getting paid. When are you getting paid? What is your credit? All of those things. That's expected of you. It actually shows that you're inexperienced if you don't ask for it. Because everybody else who's been doing this is of course they're asking for it.
yeah. Right. So how does a standard contract differ for various roles like, an actor versus a
Yeah.
director or a writer?
So, if your project is a union project, if it's governed under SAG or DGA, those contracts or WGA, those union contracts are all going to have very, very specific requirements that must be in the agreements with whether it's a director, writer, or actor. So that's going to be quite different than anything you might see in a crew deal for an associate producer, where you're not governed by a union. But essentially, fundamentally, of course they'll differ between all of those roles, and also it will be different depending on the stature of the person in the industry. So a negotiation with someone who's never directed before is going to be quite different than negotiating with Steven Spielberg. It's like, and one might take you a short amount of time and one might take you a year and a half. These negotiations can go on a really long time if you're dealing with someone with stature in the industry, unless you're giving them everything they want right away. Um, but generally, there are some key components of either contract that you're going to have in either contract. Obviously, you're going to set out the terms of the compensation, and you're going to set out the kind of what we call guaranteed compensation. This is more for directors, actors, writers. Guaranteed compensation is what they're going to be paid over the course of production. Um, and then there's something called contingent compensation or back end. And so historically, there would be a pool set aside for talent, directors, writers, producers. And from that pool of money that comes in once the project starts getting distributed or licensed, the the key cast and the key crew, meaning actors, directors, that kind of role, lead actors, would share in the producer's profits from the film. And that's called contingent compensation. And it's also referred to as back end or share of net proceeds. But with the advent of the streamer dominance, there was a switch in how people got compensated on the back end. And what the streamers began to do was pay an upfront premium to the producer instead of trying to calculate back end, because the streamer's accounting model is not the same as, for example, if you get theatrical distribution and you're looking at box office receipts. So it currently, although now it's looking like it might change back again, but currently the back end is actually a front end upfront payment called a premium or a cost plus deal. And in this case, the actors, writers, directors, depending on what they negotiate, might also share in the producer's premium from their contract with the Netflixes of the world. But obviously, you're going to want to set out the terms of someone's compensation. You're going to want to discuss their credit. These are really important elements. You're going to want to talk about, when does principal photography start? When does pre-production start? How long is the length of employment of the person? And on the producer side, what's probably most important is something called a work for hire provision, which has to be in every contract for anybody who's contributing anything, any kind of intellectual property to the film. And what it means is that the director, actor, editor, whoever the person may be, is agreeing that all work they do in connection with the particular film is going to be owned exclusively by the producer. And if you don't have that kind of provision and you have what's called a shaky, like, or not clean chain of title to who owns the film, it's not going to get distributed, because nobody wants to get sued. And when you're delivering your film to a distributor, part of what you're delivering is all the cast and crew agreements, all your releases. And if they check them and they don't see work for hire provisions, they're either going to say, well, you got to go amend this agreement, which may be hard to do because maybe it's 5 years later and you can't find the person anymore, or you've fallen out with them and now they don't want to sign the agreement. Who knows? Um, or they're going to say, you have to somehow fix this, or we're not gonna take the risk of getting sued because you didn't get this agreement signed, as it, with all of the terms and conditions that are required for us to distribute without threat of a lawsuit.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. There's so many different areas that you have to think about to put into the contract, and that's definitely why you hire a lawyer to do that, because they're thinking of things that you're not thinking about, or no sometimes. Are
Oh
you
my god,
educating your
yes.
clients a lot?
Yeah, I and honestly, It's much easier for lawyers, I think, to work with people who have some knowledge of the business and how things work, because otherwise we are doing a lot of educating, and that can be very time consuming. And for someone who doesn't have a sufficient legal budget, it's complicated. Um, but the other thing that I tell people is you have to budget appropriately for legal fees because there's just no way to avoid hiring an attorney. And it's not even what your preference is. It's anybody who's going to take on your film and distribute it. They need to know that you had a lawyer working on it. Again, they don't want to get sued because a contract didn't get signed or you distributed a bunch of contracts that didn't have the necessary provisions. um, but it's also like there are minefields out there that if you're not a lawyer and you're not doing this every day, how on earth would you know about that? I always like tell people like I don't pretend to be a movie director. I wouldn't know the first thing about picking up a camera. So why would you assume that a director has any idea about what should be in the legal documentation?
Right. Yeah. Scope of work is talked about a lot. Do you mind telling us what the importance and what that how do we figure out what the scope of the work in the to put in a film contract is?
So, I mean, it can go if you really know that you want a crew member to do something very specific, um, you can describe it in the services that they are providing for you. There's always a provision in these contracts that is a description of the services to be provided. You can do it kind of in a shorthand way and say, director will provide all services required of directors of first class feature films in the entertainment industry. That's a way of kind of like saying you're going to do whatever a director is expected to do. But if there are things that are maybe outside the scope of what a director is supposed to do, for example, you might want to specifically lay those terms out. But it really just depends. Again, if you're gonna do I mean, it might be, for example, that you're working with an editor, or a writer for a screenplay, and you wanna specify, "Okay, for this fee, you're gonna give me a treatment, a first draft, 2 polishes, and a final, and you're gonna do it over this period of time, and this is what you're gonna get paid for each step of the deal." There's something that people should understand. There are things called step deals, meaning like they're going step by step. So if you and typically with a production company and a writer, for example, the writer will write the treatment and the production company may decide, "Oh, terrible, I don't like that." And they may just not decide not to go any further. But if it goes on to step 2, which is the first draft of the screenplay, then they will pay the writer for that. But again, there can be a number of steps along the way. So you don't have to pay for all of those steps at one time. You kind of do it in the course of the schedule that you and the writer agreed on.
Yeah, and what about crew members that take on multiple roles? If they're being asked to do, like, let's say they're, directing and then they're also writing part of it.
Yep.
Does this ever happen where somebody is called in to write or direct during the production? And then what happens then? They have to go back and redo a contract?
I mean, let's say somebody wrote a screenplay
Mhm.
and then they're going into production and it's decided that now we want this writer. We want Jane not just to write the screenplay, but we want her to direct as well. At that point, you would have to do a director's agreement. And in general, we keep those agreements separate. It's very common for a director to also be a producer, but we just do those as two separate agreements.
Okay. And then I know that there's a lot of probably still going on today discrepancy in payment for men versus women who are doing the same job. I was just curious, like, do you have a rate sheet that you use? And then if you get a contract and you say, hey, wait a minute, you're being totally underpaid for this contract, or is that something that the manager advises? Like, what's the difference between a manager's role? Because they, I would think, would typically get the contract and then bring in the lawyer, but how does that work?
Well, as far as like a rate sheet, what you can do if you're a director, writer, or actors is go onto the site for the applicable union, and they have rate sheets that you can check. But if you're not a union member, there's no obligation to pay you the minimum, the union minimums. But it's always a negotiation.
Right.
It's always a negotiation, and it will depend a lot on what is the project, what is the budget for the project. That's really, really crucial. And you might not know it at the time. So sometimes the way you can set the fee is by saying the director or the writer, let's say, will receive, I'm making this up, but like 2.5% of the final approved ingoing budget for the film. If you don't know what's, because a lot of times at the time you're commissioning a screenplay, you don't know yet what the budget's going to be because you might need to see the screenplay first to determine what kind of budget you're looking at. But as far as rate sheets, you can always look at the guilds. I certainly don't have my own rate sheet, but a manager, if someone does have a manager, they will know what the person's precedent has been. They're going to want to certainly not go below their precedent. But, again, it's like it's one of these things where if somebody really loves a project and it's a low budget film, they may elect to direct it just because, it's a labor of love more than about money. But, the manager, I'll tell you, it's oftentimes agents. In my experience, I've mostly dealt with somebody, I'm working with somebody's agent as opposed to a manager, although it's not exclusively that way. But the agent will get approached. And obviously, if the talent or director doesn't have an agent, they'll go to the manager and they'll try to agree on some key deal terms in terms of compensation, credit, whatever else might be important to their client. And then we get brought in to do like more of the heavy lifting in terms of putting together the contract and negotiating it. Not always. I mean, a lot of times agents can handle it themselves. Like, these contracts are not that varied. So it might be but they most of the time always want a lawyer to at least look at it. Sometimes people don't have agents, and then the production company with their lawyer will make an offer, and then we get put in touch directly with the talent's attorney, and we just negotiate with their attorney without any agent or manager involvement, but it just depends on the person.
Right. Are what clauses should be included in addressing like overtime and additional compensation?
So, I think what's most important on, if you're directing, for example, or producing, a feature film and it's like they're saying, okay, this is going to be, I don't know, 30 weeks of work. And then it turns into 60 weeks of work. You do have to, as the director producer, you have to protect against that. And so what we put in contracts when we're representing producers and directors is that as just a simple statement that if the schedule extends beyond such and such date, we will negotiate in good faith for the compensation after that period. For overtime, if you're on the production side, you want to make sure that people are reaching out, the crew is reaching out to get pre-approval before they go and do overtime because overtime's really expensive. And, you're always working within this budget that is kind of like not a flexible thing. So you don't want people unilaterally deciding that they will work overtime without consulting with you first. So we've put a provision representing the production company saying just that. Don't work overtime unless we approve it. But again, going back to unions, like all of the unions have specific overtime provisions in their union agreements that the production company will have to comply with if it's a union production.
Yeah, I guess it's the people that are non-union that it becomes the problem because sometimes things will happen and nobody's stopping the production because of it, with the
I mean,
overtime and stuff.
you really have to be able to speak up for yourself. You can't just sit there and like keep working if you know you're working overtime. People in this industry, I think, are far too fearful of, oh, I'll get fired. And, I guess that's possible. But then, you're not really, especially in states like California and New York, employers have to be fairly careful of not violating the numerous pro employee labor laws in these states. And I have to say, I'm not as familiar with California as with New York, although I do know California has the strongest most employee friendly labor laws in the country. So if you really feel like you're getting taken advantage of, or if you feel like, or if you go to your employer and they say, "Oh, you asked about overtime, you're fired." That would be, I think that wouldn't even really be legal. So, you might have to then take another step, which is there are ways to complain to the Fair Employment Housing Authority in California or the DOL in New York State. If you feel like something your employer is not fairly compensating you or it's retaliating against you. Um, so I think it would be really useful. And I don't know. I just feel like, honestly, film schools don't do a great job about teaching people who are going to be in the industry the business side of it. And, they should have like a labor law session and they should have like a contracts law session and intellectual property. What is that? What are we even talking about? What does this mean? And, it's great to know how to make a movie and direct a movie and produce a movie. But again, it's a business and you don't have to know everything about the business. But if you don't want to spend the money, on outside people to help you, then you've got to become educated.
Right. Yeah, and then, how do you, like, how does cast and crew, like, protect themselves, from, um, work conditions and hours, that are not great? And I think, like, what you were talking about, when it comes to somebody, saying, "Hey, you're asking us to work overtime, and that wasn't in our contract." It's really hard because there are groups of people where they'll just buck it up and do it, and then there's the one person that's standing up to say, "Wait, this isn't right," but then
hmm
everybody else is doing it. How do
You
you
know, I guess my thought on that would be, it may not be a bad idea if this is happening to you to consult with an attorney, even just do like an hour or two consultation in your state to understand what the law is in that state and what your options are. Like, do I complain to the Department of Labor? Do I go to HR? What's the best course of action? Document everything. Um, and sometimes you have to weigh it out, to be honest. It's like, I mean, I'm not going to say there's not a lot of exploitation in the entertainment industry. Like, that's not a surprise, right? But if you're not going to speak up about it, it's not going to stop.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, can I, ask you this? What should be included in a contract to handle potential, like, disputes or breaches?
Right. Okay. So let me use like a specific contract as an example. Let's use director agreement as an example. So in a director agreement, we will explain what is a material breach of the agreement? What does that even mean? Is it that they don't show up to work? Is it that they violated the policies of the production company, anti-harassment policies. I mean, it's those kinds of things where somebody is either um or for example, you find out that the director took some intellectual property from another director. Like, for example, maybe the setup of a particular scene, the camera angles, all of the creative elements of a particular scene are ripped off from another director. That would be something that would be a material breach because um, unless they, and I'll, what happens in every one of these kinds of agreements is that the director, both parties make representations and warranties, which means they're making certain promises. And if they don't keep those promises or they break those promises, that's oftentimes consistent with the material breach of the agreement. So you know, if you're a director, you're representing that everything you contribute to the film is going to be original with you, and it's not going to violate anybody else's copyright, for example. So if you do violate someone else's copyright, you breached a representation, and that would be a material breach of the agreement. Again, violating any company policies, not showing up for work. There's a bunch of different things that can be defined as material breaches, or it can just be any breach of the agreement that remains uncured, and I'll explain what that means after notice to the director. So if, for example, the director is supposed to attend a shoot and they fail to attend a shoot, and I mean, obviously that's not a great example because they know, but let's say they inadvertently forgot, I don't know, they forgot to do something they were supposed to do. And the production company, it might be written into the contract that the production company will give the director 5 days notice to attempt to fix their mistake. And if they fix it within that period of time, that 5-day period, then the breach is quote unquote cured, and the contract won't be terminated. There are going to be certain things that are probably, and then there'll be a provision that says, but that depends on that being. There are some breaches that are not cannot be cured. So, for example, if the director sexually harasses 5 people on the set, that's not a curable breach.
Thank
If
God.
right. But, if somebody is accused, but there's no fact basis behind it, that's different. But if there's really there's an investigation and it's shown that in fact this did happen, then that would not be curable in terms of a breach. So you always want to put in there that the cast or crew member, part of what they're agreeing to is all of the anti-harassment policies, all other company policies. When we were in the midst of COVID, we would have something in these agreements that said, you're agreeing you're going to comply with all COVID policies of the company and of state and local law with respect to COVID. So, that can change depending on what's going on at any given time. But you really want to make sure that the person is doing what they're promising to do in the time frame that they're promising to do it, not doing anything they're not authorized to do. So, for example, someone who's the director of a film may not have any rights to sign a contract on behalf of the company to take a loan. That would really be well outside the scope of what the director is allowed to do. But these are provisions that are included in every agreement. And then typically what happens is that a production company wants disputes resolved through binding arbitration because that is confidential. or mediation. Um, and mediation can be very effective as well. So it's just a kind of preference. But most of the time, we do see that the disputes are resolved through finding arbitration. Nobody wants to be the subject of a lawsuit. So that's why companies try to do that. And it's really hard to get them to change their minds on that. They're not going to say, okay, that's fine. Yeah, we'll actually consent to be sued if you're pissed off at us.
Right. Well, that kind of leads us to the termination clause. What's the significance of including that into film contracts?
I mean, that has to be included. That's a really, really important provision because, sometimes things don't work out and, or somebody, again, does something really wrong. You want to be able to terminate them right away. Um, or they're just really bad. It turns out they're really bad at their job and you need to bring in another editor. So we just, or they may not even be bad. They just may not be right for this project, you know? So, in that situation, the way we'll draft these termination provisions is that typically, I'll just say the editor will get paid up through the date of termination. Um, but you can terminate them like without notice and you can hire somebody else. What you might have to negotiate is what credit does the editor get if you bring in a new editor? And that can be sticky.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and at what point, how much have they edited
right.
and then get terminated? Like, well, wait a minute, I did the whole film. They just
Right, but if you're not using any of that cut, like, if it's just, like, we're just starting from scratch, then it's less yeah, it's less about that, but, I've definitely seen projects where directors are replaced and, or editors or whatever, and you have to kind of handle that carefully. But again, it's like if somebody has done something horrible, they have a lot less a leg to stand on than if it's just like, well, I don't really like your work product, but you were fine. You just didn't do what I wanted. And then maybe you negotiate something with them like a co-director credit or associate or whatever it is.
yeah. And what about AI?
Oh,
I'm seeing that a lot where they're using the images, younger images of actors. I mean, it's kind of amazing, but at the same time, how do we protect, cast members or what do we need to address in the contracts for the likeness and image rights?
so what we have begun to put in all our contracts is that um, there shall be no use of this person's name, image, likeness in connection with any AI unless you have their prior written consent. So we just withhold it altogether, but we call it out instead of just saying something like all rights not granted under this contract are expressly reserved. We have a specific section that's basically the no AI section. And it may be that it's got certain carve outs if, for example, the actor wants or is, there's some component of the film, like you said, where it's required because we're trying to show this person 30 years ago. Maybe they consent to that use, but no other use. So it is important to include it in the contracts if you're representing the talent that it's not permissible, except for these three uses. And in any event, you have to come back to the talent to get their prior written consent and negotiate with them for that use. Otherwise, it's a breach.
What about somebody who's deceased? Can you bring them in, or is somebody representing the rights of
Yeah.
the deceased? How does that
Yes.
work?
Yeah. So there's something called a right of publicity, which it does extend to deceased celebrities. So if you want to do some kind of AI version of Marilyn Monroe, you have to get permission from her estate.
Hmm, wow. Well, that's great. I mean, I there's so much that we could bring people back. It's kinda scary, kind of weird, in a way, when you see movies
Yeah.
and you're like, "Whoa."
Yeah. I mean, there are certain ways you could probably use AI in certain contexts without getting permission. But again, you got to consult an attorney for that because it's going to be very, very specific for each occasion and what your intent is. But there is a what's called a post-mortem right of publicity for celebrities that so you can't just start, for example, making Marilyn Monroe Barbie dolls or whatever without licensing those rights from her estate.
Mhm. Okay. Well, that's good to know, if any of us pass
Yeah.
away.
Yes,
You
but you
might
have to
wanna
be
tell the
famous.
estates. Yeah. Exactly, exactly. So how can film contracts be structured to account for potential project delays or changes?
So, I'm gonna use the director agreement again as the example, but in every director agreement, we put in a provision that talks about suspension and talks about force majeure. And so suspension is basically, let's say you're halfway through a shoot of a film and the company runs out of money. So they might stop down and they might suspend everybody until they can get their financing back up, for example. And what it means also for the talent, they're not required to wait around forever though. So if typically if the suspension extends beyond 8 weeks, then the talent will be able to go and work on other projects. They might have to come back, but they don't have to wait around indefinitely until the money is raised or whatever is caused. A lot of times, suspensions might be caused by illness of a lead actor, for example, or illness of director. That's a reason that things get suspended. Um, and for so for the talent, they just want to make sure that there's no quote selective suspension. For example, only the director is getting suspended, but everybody else continues to work. So there's always a negotiation around the suspension paragraph, but it's always in there. And we also always include what's called a force majeure paragraph, which everybody edited after or during COVID to include pandemic as a reason, as a force majeure reason. But what it really means is it's it's an act of nature or war or something completely outside anybody's control that results in the film not being able to uh, continue being produced. So it could be pandemic, it could be an earthquake, anything like that outside of anyone's control. And then the project will get delayed for the length generally, it's for the length of the force majeure event. But, for example, again, like with something like COVID, which let's say it lasted 12 months, like that's too long. So, if I'm representing a director, I'm gonna try to negotiate something that says, "Okay, we'll agree that the force majeure extension extends through the, quote, force majeure period. However, if it's longer than whatever, 3 months, we're not tied to the exclusivity provisions in the contract. We'll come back, but we don't have to sit around and wait."
Right, yeah. I mean, all these things are so important, to think about, and my final question to you would be is, what are some questions a person should ask when finding a lawyer, and when do they need to get one?
So, as far as getting a lawyer, it it sounds a little counterintuitive, but the sooner you get a lawyer involved, the less expensive it will cost. Because what often happens is we're brought in way too late or even just a little late, and things are kind of baked already. And for us to unbake them and fix them causes, it's twice as much time. Where if you just, came to an attorney in the beginning and said, okay, I want to do this project, and you laid it out and you could get advice like right at that moment. Like, do you need to option a book? How are you going to do that? As the, underlying intellectual property for your film. Um, you know, just give us an overview, because even from that moment, an attorney can be helpful in guiding you and saying, oh, well, if you're going to do this, you should think about this. Or did you think about this tax credit that you'd be able to get if you shoot in Georgia? Whatever it is, it actually can be a great money saver. And, we have the documents, we have the crew deals and the director agreements. And so a lot of people pull something off the internet that is essentially not worth the paper it's written on, and then you have to do it all over again. And it's harder because at that point you've entered into an agreement with someone, and they may say, "We have an agreement. I don't want to do another agreement." You really have lost all your leverage at that point. Um, as far as speaking to an attorney and what do you look for? Don't hire a real estate attorney. Don't hire a tax attorney. I know that sounds funny, but a lot of people are like, well, my sister's husband's friend is a lawyer. Well, it's so specialized. I mean, as an entertainment lawyer, I don't do any music work. There's a lot of entertainment work I don't do because I don't know anything about it. So if I don't know about it, like, how is a real estate lawyer supposed to know about film production? But people, I understand it. People are looking for inexpensive ways to do this. But I feel like if you don't have the money to hire a lawyer, you should get that money somehow, because it's going to save you so much money. Um, and again, I think it's hard for people are creative, they're bursting with their ideas and they want to just do it, and they're not really primed and trained to understand this part of it. But what they have to think about is it's not just about what you as a producer or a filmmaker feel comfortable with. Do you want to distribute your film? Do you want your film to get into festivals? Do you want anybody to see it? Because no one's going to take on the risk of what you're comfortable with. There are industry standards that have to be complied with. So you can go and make a beautiful film, but you haven't cleared anything and you don't have any agreements. Your family will see it, but no one will see it. So that's one thing. And then, obviously you got to find an attorney you can afford. Um, so you want to ask very up, right away, what are their rates? What are their hourly rates? And explain the work that you think you need so they can give you a sense of an estimate, because no one can guarantee you it's going to definitely cost this much money, because things can come up. But there's certainly firms out there that do flat fee production legal work. So if you can find one of those firms, you can try that and understand that. But again, you should look on IMDb and see what kind of projects the attorney has worked on. Um, Attorneys have websites. You can read about them. You can read about what they do and what panels they spoke on, or whatever it is, or what did they write about. And you can find out a lot about them. And obviously ask friends, because word of mouth, if someone's had a good experience with an attorney, that's a very good way to find somebody. Um, but I think overall, you wouldn't start a business. You just wouldn't start any business, which making a film is a business. You wouldn't start a business without kind of doing this kind of diligence and this kind of work. And you wouldn't enter into agreements with your CEO and your employees and whoever else you need, so your vendors, probably wouldn't do that without an attorney.
No, I totally agree to that. Just okay. I just thought of two more questions. One is when hiring an attorney, let's say you're in California, it would probably be wise to hire somebody in California because they would know the California laws, or does it matter? And then what if that person then moved to New York? Should they get a new attorney in New York, or does it?
No, I mean, we work on a ton of California-based productions. It really doesn't matter. Um, when it matters is, again, like, if you have a labor law, personal labor law question, you wanna find a personal attorney in the state where the labor law issue is arising, but, I mean, we work on productions that are based all over the country. We work on UK-based productions, so, that doesn't really matter.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Yeah, I just wasn't sure. And then just the final question was, when do you create the contract and when are you reviewing the contract? So is it the production company comes up with the contract? You like an actor, if they're coming on, they don't say, "Oh, could you get me up a contract?" It's more you're reviewing the contract that it's been given to you by the production company. Is that how it typically
Yeah,
works?
that's always how it works. It's the production company will always provide the crew deals, the talent deals. Again, that's part of their production budget should be this line item for legal, which will, cover all that work. But it's certainly not the responsibility, or is it expected that the crew or the cast is going to come up with their own agreements. Now, that being said, if you're an editor, for example, and you've been editing for 25 years and you've got your form of agreement, you might want to try to give it to the production company, but any kind of sophisticated production company is going to want to use their own documents.
So you may, as an editor, you may say, "Hey, as you're reviewing the contract and what or the items that you want in it, you can always just say, "Hey, can you revise this part of it, based on what, your contract might have been." That would be okay
Yeah.
to just.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like everything everything's negotiable. So, and everything should be negotiable because that's how you get to kind of a fair agreement. And you know, a lot of people, but especially women, do not ask for things. And I would like to leave this podcast with that note to all my sisters out there that if you don't ask, no one's going to give it to you. And you got to get in the habit of asking for things for yourself because it's not going to fall out of a tree and land in your lap. You have to be your own advocate. Especially if you can't afford an attorney, you have to learn to speak up for yourself and not be afraid of it. And the more you do it, the less afraid you'll become. But it's with that note, it's difficult. People don't like that. They don't like to do it. But I think again, the more you practice it, the more it starts to become second nature. And then you'll like forget that you ever were nervous about it.
I totally agree. I mean, half the battle is just speaking up, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. But it's the first couple of times that are a little like, "Ooh," you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's okay. You can be nervous, and then you'll see you did it. And then you'll be less nervous the next time, and, you know, you gotta start somewhere.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for being on the show today. It was just a pleasure having you.
It was so great to talk to you, Tammy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. I encourage you to get out there and make a film. Reach out to your local filmmakers group to get involved and connect. Please subscribe to the show if you like it, and follow me on Instagram at Tammy Magaro. Until we meet again, what's your story?